We have the Seed, who's calling in from the U.S. The Seed, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
What's up, man? How y'all doing?
Doing okay, the Seed. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I feel like you're getting left out, Dan, so I'm going to try and mainly talk to you.
No, that's okay. If anything,
no, go ahead.
I talk way too much. That is probably the most common criticism I get, which is fine, and it's because it's true. But you don't have to do that. Talk to Kelly as much as you want, or talk to me. Whatever floats your boat, the Seed.
I mean, I was chatting with Kelly a little bit earlier on the live stream, but whatever y'all want to, whichever one of y'all want to talk.
Well, I believe you talked to the call screener already. So I see that you talked to him and said you were interested in talking about the dating of the New Testament and how it impacts the credence of the Bible.
Yeah, I think it's important to establish when it was dated, because if it was dated late, it's kind of hard to take it seriously as eyewitness testimony. Whereas
Yes.
if it's dated early, it's more likely that, or it makes it possible at least, that it's.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Obviously, conservative estimates on the scholarship date it at the earliest being like 70-ish AD, right? Not much really before that because of specific events that are kind of talked about, in the Gospels. There's some, details there that we don't have to get into in the show. But yeah, there are, of course, religious scholars that try to date it earlier than that, but mainstream consensus doesn't put the Gospels too much earlier than around that time.
I think the mainstream consensus is like 70 AD to like 110 AD or something like that.
110 for the Gospel of John, correct. The consensus is that Mark is the earliest gospel, with Matthew and Luke coming afterwards because they share a similar source. That's where the hypothetical Q document comes in, where some people say that there's another source that Matthew and Luke are borrowing from that's outside of Mark. But yeah, Mark is considered the earliest. John, much later, 80 AD at the very earliest. It could be as late as 110 AD for some people. But yeah, that's pretty much where the consensus of the scholarship's at.
Well, yeah, let me work backwards on it then. So the New Testament we have now, would y'all agree it's the same as the what's called an autograph, which is like the original manuscript that the authors of the Gospels would have wrote down?
No.
It's interesting you ask that. Certainly, I'm not qualified to say one way or another. I can only, again, pretty much recite what scholars have said. But it's debatable to say how much we can really say about what is said in the gospel account. The earliest fragments we have, because we don't have complete accounts of the gospel, date, I think, to like 110 AD or like 130 AD. And that's like a paragraph. Or even that, I think it's like a few sentences. It's not full gospel accounts. We just don't have those original texts. And that's a problem with like a lot of early historical literature, right? A lot of what we have is just what's recorded from like monks and monasteries, who are just copying these books by hand for years and years and years and years later. So, that's not a problem that's unique to the early gospels. But suffice to say, we're never going to be able to know for sure whether we have early copies. What's interesting is we do have examples of things being added later, right? One of them, most famously, is in the Gospel of John, where it talks about the lady who was going to be stoned to death for adultery, and the woman, not adultery, but being a prostitute, basically, right? And Jesus says, no, don't do this thing. This is not found in the earliest manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of John, interestingly enough. So there are some things that are definitely different. How much is different, I can't tell you. Anyway, that's a long answer. Sorry.
That's definitely correct. There's no evidence of that story in any early manuscripts. They're all from the medieval period.
Yeah.
I know that some of the things that are in Papyrus 137 aren't the same as they are in our current edition of the New Testament. So
Yeah.
And that's the oldest edition of Mark that we had. Well, pieces of Mark that we have. So
Yes.
and some of the lines in that have changed over time. So I don't
Yes.
think that what was originally written down is what we're reading today. No.
Yes.
And I also think that it's been changed in translation as well. I don't think that some of the words translated very well from one language to another, and some of the translations we read were a translation of a translation.
Yeah, this is another problem that account that is against the Gospels, right? And sorry, the seed. I'll be quick with this. And this is because there's an argument that's being made here that the Gospels were actually originally transcribed from a Arabic source, right? Because it's written in Greek. Jesus wasn't speaking Greek, when he was walking around Jerusalem, right? They weren't speaking Greek. They would have been speaking Aramaic. Sorry, not Aramaic. Anyway, I'm tired. I'm not getting my words right. But anyway, so there's some people that are saying no because some of the metaphors and language that's used in the New Testament kind of only makes sense in Koine, in the Greek tongue rather than Aramaic. So there's even more layers you can get to on why we shouldn't believe that they are firsthand accounts of anybody, right? That these are more likely stories that are cobbled together by later authors rather than anything firsthand. So do I believe that they're firsthand accounts? No. I think that the names of the Gospels, which are later attestations created by the church, right, are just that. They're just later attestations. So we call it the Gospel of Mark because the church called it the Gospel of Mark. I don't think that Mark, follower of Jesus, necessarily wrote down everything that's in there. Same goes with the other Gospels.
Yeah, and not to get on too much of a tangent, but we can definitely infer that they were speaking Aramaic because of the names in the Bible. For instance, there's you mainly find it with instead of saying the word Ben, which means son of, in Bar, which means son of in Aramaic. So like instead of Ben Sabbas, it says Bar Sabbas, or instead of Bartholomew, it says Bartholomew.
I mean, again, we can only speculate because we have no Aramaic sources whatsoever. Right. And if Mark wrote these things, or John, or anybody, they had all had to have known Greek as well as Aramaic, which is not plausible because we're talking about the literacy of a fisherman, right? Of a working class person in that time that doesn't have the education, one, to really write things, but to be able to write full gospel accounts, in other languages that isn't their native tongue. That's suspicious, right? It seems that at least another source has to be translating it, at least. Even more than that, what I think is more likely is that these are people speaking a different language who are talking about these stories and are probably coming up with a lot of them too, or at least transcribing oral tradition rather than firsthand accounts. I think that's the more likely explanation.
Well, they definitely had there's a technical name for it, but they're basically secretaries back then who would write down what you're saying. And I know Paul definitely refers to talk about one. But yeah, I'd like to make an argument for the Gospels being pre-70 AD, but in order to get to that, I'd have to come to a consensus with you about the how we can be sure that they haven't been added to the Gospels and everything. And
yes.
The main way we do that is do you know about something called textual criticism?
Yes.
And so
yeah, I'm familiar.
Then so like pretty much any ancient documents, we don't have the original, autograph of it. We have to use textual criticism to kind of work backwards and figure out to a certain degree of confidence what the original autograph was.
Yes.
And but we can do that. We can do the same thing. We can do that with the New Testament, and we can do it very well because there's tens of thousands of manuscripts. So it's not like having to decide between one or two manuscripts. Does it say this? Does it say that? They have thousands and thousands of manuscripts to compare and contrast, and it's a very complicated science actually. Like they put different weights on what's earlier versus later.
Yes, and I'm not trying to dismiss your point because yes, in one thing that the Bible has an advantage of at least the Gospels, over other historical sources is the fact that we do have as many copies as we do, right? But unfortunately, that can also go against itself in a way, because we also have a lot of copies of other things from early times. Like there's other Gospels that aren't in the Bible that we also have copies of, right? Granted, we don't have as many copies, right? We definitely have more of what's considered the mainstream canon, but we do have other surviving copies of other sources, which means that they were at least taken seriously by some people at some time. It doesn't lead any credency, I think, to the legitimacy of those stories, which is, I think, the main problem here. We can talk about how many copies that we have of something and how much we can verify based through textual criticisms about what's true to the original source all day long, but it doesn't necessarily point to the stories themselves being true, right? That's kind of the problem for me, at least at the end of the day.
I see where you're coming from. I'm going to try to make an argument for it being pre-70 AD, but if we can't both agree it's the original thing, you can just say, well, that was added later, or, some scribe later on put that in there. But, like you were saying, the thing in John, there's probably like 4 or 5 real big parts in the Bible where it'll even say in modern translations, this part,
yes,
you can't find this part in early manuscripts. It'll say it's an interpolation.
Yes.
And there's very, very few. So,
yeah, I agree with you. It's not as many, right? A lot of the interpolations are small in nature, usually grammatical in nature, right? But the fact that we at least know of some kind of gives us the question of, well, what about the others? Because again, we don't have anything before almost 100 years after Jesus's death, right? So how can we really say for sure that any of this stuff is going to be the real deal? A lot can happen in 100 years. I just can't buy the argument that we have to be more receptive to the idea that these stories are legitimate. And by legitimate, I mean actual firsthand accounts of people who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because we have fragments that match up with each other 100 years later, right? I don't think it necessarily leans me towards, believing the accounts anymore than what I already believe at, which is not believing them. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, if we can just agree, it's not identical, but if we can agree it's virtually the same or pretty close to the original autographs, then my
we don't have the original autographs. So no, I can't agree with you there. We don't know what that is.
Well, yeah, but we don't have an original autograph of the Republic, but we can use textual criticism to establish what, with a high degree of confidence, what the Republic was.
Sure, but we also know that the Republic's been changed too over time and stuff, right? Like, it also hasn't been consistent over time.
I haven't looked into the textual criticism of the Republic. I just know that it's another book, ancient book. We don't have the original of.
Yeah, and again, this is something that is true for all ancient stories or all ancient literature, I should specify, right? But the difference is too, that Plato's Republic is not necessarily, I think, supposed to be taken as a literal account. I guess there are some people that really think Plato was out here having dialogue with folks and just owning people left and right, and he just kind of like wrote about it just as a humble brag. I don't think that's the case. I think this is followers attributing, stuff, and then Plato writing things themselves, right? I mean, there's lots of interpretations on what we could say about that.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the difference here is, again, a fictional piece versus something that is claiming to be 100% factual. Like it's not on the same level,
Yeah. Well, let me just say, anything in my argument, it's not an interpolation. There's no evidence that it was a later addition in any manuscripts. But it mainly has to do with are you familiar with the Book of Acts?
Yes. And sorry, I said Plato owning people. I mean Socrates, but it's Plato writing about Socrates. But anyway, sorry, Kelly. I feel like I'm
No,
talking a lot in this conversation.
I wanted to give. I sat back. I sat back on purpose. So,
but yeah, I'm familiar with the Book of Acts.
One of the reasons why I think the Republic is a bad thing to compare it though to is that nobody's basing their moral standards on the Republic.
Yeah, that's also true. Also, we're not basing our salvation on the Republic, which is a big deal.
There's such a thing as Neoplatonism. There's a whole, philosophy, religion, whatever you want to call it, that's based on the writings of Plato.
Yes, but that's a Christian interpretation of Platonism, mostly.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, a lot of early Christians were former Neoplatonists.
Yeah. But we're getting off topic here, the seed. Let's say that, I mean, did you?
Here's my argument.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
In the Book of Acts, it's a very historical kind of book. It goes through, different, histories that happen. It talks about the reign of, I think it's Claudius, and about how the Jews got kicked out of Rome during the reign of Claudius. It talks about a famine that happens in the Roman world. It's very just what's going on, what's happening, and stuff like that. But here's the thing: is that there's a few things, huge things that are missing from the Book of Acts, and probably the biggest one is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Yeah.
Which it's hard to compare, but it would be like a similar thing would be like writing a history of New York in the early 2000s, and for some reason not including 9/11.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just don't think Acts is a historical book. I think Acts describes particular historical events, but I don't think that makes it a historical book. It also talks about how Paul is on an island where no snakes are there, and he gets bitten by a venomous snake and survives. Like, that's also in the Book of Acts. Also in the Book of Acts, somebody dies because they lied about not having money to give to the church. You know what I mean? So, like, I don't know if we should be counting the Book of Acts as anything historical, but I guess if you're talking about historical in that it's describing historical events, I mean, it does make references to it, but it's certainly not a chronology. Like, it's certainly not like a history textbook on events at the time.
Wait, tell me what island doesn't have snakes on it, because I'd like to listen to that later. Is it Crete?
What? Say. Well, I believe, was it, the details here is, I believe Paul is on, is it Patmos, right? Am I right about this, Kelly? I gotta remember this, but Paul is basically doing his thing, and then he gets bitten by a snake, and then he lives. But there's like no venomous snakes in the area of which he supposedly is at.
Yeah, I'm not sure what island it was. Patmos was where John lived, though.
That's right. Maybe I'm getting mixed up with John. But anyway, it's details.
I'll definitely look into that for sure. But I guess to put my argument succinctly would be
Malta.
Assuming you're correct that that Acts was written after 70 AD, can you give me a reasonable explanation why several huge things are mentioned? The biggest one being the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But in addition to that, there's nothing about the siege of Rome that happens for 2 to 3 years before the temple falls in 70 AD, and more the deaths of Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, are not mentioned in Acts, though we know he died in the 60s. Yet for some reason he mentions the deaths of Stephen, who's just some random guy. He includes that, but he doesn't include Paul. Like, give me a reasonable explanation for that.
Okay, first, it's the island of Malta. Let me correct myself there. Pat, you're right. Patmos is where John of the Book of Revelation wrote the Book of Revelation. Malta is where Paul was at. It's in Acts 28, in case you want to look that up. So again, if I don't write about, if I'm talking about my own experiences and my own life story, and I don't write about, gosh, I don't know. I guess if I'm talking about something that happened to me in 2020 and I don't mention COVID, that doesn't mean that like COVID didn't happen, or that like I don't know it has anything to do with the veracity of my story being true or not. I just maybe didn't mention it in my story, right? Like, but I don't think the Gospels are meant to be a chronicle of Jewish history in Jewish politics. It certainly mentions it, and it's certainly, I mean, you can argue it's quite integral to some of the themes in the Gospel, but it's not necessarily a this happened here, then this happened here, then this happened here. I think it's a combination of different stories. If anything, the seed, it actually makes more sense that this isn't a firsthand account, that this is a cobbled together version of events from later authors, because they're picking and choosing as to what they decide to be important within the gospel accounts, right? So I don't know if this actually makes the Bible more coherent as a firsthand account, or the Gospels as a firsthand account. I think it lends to the argument that it's not a firsthand account, that it's written by other people that have decided to write other things about what they want to talk about, you know?
Yeah. Well, there's a scholarly consensus that whoever wrote Acts also wrote the Gospel of Luke. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that's true. Okay. I have no problem with that interpretation.
Predicted that the temple would fall, and literally no stone would be left unturned on it.
Sorry, you cut out for just a second there. Can you repeat yourself?
Yeah, in the Gospel of Luke, it talks about they're walking outside the temple, and they say, "Look at all these big stones. You see all this?" And Yeshua prophesies, and he says, "I'm telling you, every single, I'm paraphrasing, every single stone you see is going to be overturned. Not one will be left on top of it."
That's in Mark. That's not in Matthew. If you said Matthew.
No, it's in Matthew and Luke.
I think you're talking about Mark, because Mark that's how scholars are saying this has to have been written after 70 AD, because it's after the fall of the temple. Right? That's the crux of the argument of why Mark is at a later date. Or at the date that it's at, not a later date, because Mark is the earliest.
Yeah, I think all three of the Synoptic Gospels contain the prophecy about the temple falling.
I mean, they might. I think there may be some references to it in other ones, but that is like the central crux of why we date Mark the way that we do, right? Is because it talks about those events. Because it makes more sense that somebody is talking about those events after the fact they happened, rather than somebody prophesying about something that hasn't happened yet, right?
Right, but that's my point is, suppose you are, do a thought experiment. Suppose me and you or you're Luke, and you're writing the gospel and you're writing Acts after 70 AD, and you write your gospel and you put, that Yeshua predicted that the temple would fall. Why wouldn't you then include in Acts that the temple did fall? Because that would help give credence to the claim that he's a prophet. Doesn't make any sense.
Because Acts isn't talking about Jesus. Acts is describing the followers of Jesus.
Yeah, but the same guy who wrote Luke wrote Acts. So if
why would he write the same thing again in a different book?
Oh, because it would make him look like a prophet if he said in one book that, hey, he's predicting this temple is gonna fall, and then in the sequel in Acts he says, oh look, it did fall. That would give credence to him being a prophet.
Yeah, I think this is another case of you kind of proving my point that there may be interpolations in Luke, right? Because why wouldn't he write about that? Maybe because Luke has also been handled in some way or another. But I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that's the case. I'm just saying that we don't have original records of any of this stuff. I think it's very fair to claim, as most scholars do, that Luke and Acts are written by the same person. But what is him not mentioning one thing in one book but mentioning it in another? I don't think that gives you any favors in this argument, right? I don't think that actually helps your case. I I don't think I don't think it serves to the interest of it being earlier in time.
Well, no, but the part I'm referencing isn't an interpolation. It's not a part that's like up for question or anything. It's found in the early manuscripts.
And then again, that's fine.
I don't think,
but like, why does that matter?
I don't think it, because for me, I try to think about things reasonably, and if I don't think it's reasonable for someone to write Luke and Acts after 70 AD to put in Luke a prophecy about the temple falling after the fact, and then not fulfill that prophecy in Acts. That doesn't make any sense.
I don't think it makes any sense that somebody is saying that somebody rose from the dead either. I mean, like we could talk about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. I think there's a lot of other events that are talked about there that are lend more, to questionability than why would this person put something here and then not another thing here? I don't think maybe we're talking past each other here, but like I don't see how this serves the case for Christianity in any meaningful way. But we've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm worried that we're getting too in the weeds for our core audience for me to understand. I'm trying to like explain the points that I'm coming from, or the points where I'm getting this information from as I'm going. So hopefully this is educational for people who have maybe not have looked into this as much. But again, I don't see why that's a problem. That he talks about a prophecy in one book and doesn't talk about it in another book. Who cares? I don't know why that's a big deal.
Okay, well, can I make one last point or claim or whatever?
Very quickly.
Okay. Thank you for taking my call and giving me your time.
You're welcome.
Because you'd agree the writings of Paul are from the 50s and 60s, right?
The writings of Paul, according to, again, I'm not a scholar. I can't say, yeah, this is what it is, right? Everything that I say on this show, when I'm referring to any claims made about the Bible, I try to cite from consensus of scholarship. So that's just for audience to know. I'm not an academic. I'm just somebody who reads. And the consensus among scholarship is, yes, the letters from Paul, the legitimate letters, by the way, because fun fact, not all the letters in the gospel that say they're written by Paul are actually written by Paul, at least according to scholars. The ones that are written by Paul and are legitimate tend to come between 50 to the late 60s AD, right? So that's the consensus.
Yeah. Well, then can you tell me how is Paul quoting from Luke if Luke was written after 70 AD?
Well, because I think that there is an argument to be made for well, Paul wasn't reading Gospels, I don't think. Well, that's not true. He does cite some other early Christian stuff that could have been written down. I think Paul is referring a lot to oral tradition. I think there's a strong case for that. We talk about the early Christian church is not a literate group of people for the most part. Most of them are having one person read to a group of other people. And so there's a couple of different sources that go around. One of those sources, by the way, being the letters from Paul, which is why we have them in the Bible, because of their circulation along the Christian church. But they were probably looking at it from other sources as well, because he's talking about Luke, but he also, this isn't Paul, but Peter is talking from the book of Enoch, for example. That's another, kind of famous attestation that's made in the Bible, where the Bible is quoting from a book that's not in the Bible or considered not canon by the mainstream church, because they're looking at sources and dealing with stuff that just is kind of going around. Just because a part of Luke is being told by Paul doesn't mean that the entirety of Luke, as we know it today, is what existed back then. And maybe it did in some form or another, but there's also parts from Mark that seem to be very similar to Luke and are very similar to Matthew. And John has some parts that are similar to other stuff. So can we say that he's talking about Matthew specifically or Luke specifically? I don't know if we can make that case because Luke is also borrowing from other sources. So who knows? It could be Luke. It could be something else, right?
No, I understand your point of the whole oral tradition thing, but the two verses in First Timothy that he's quoting Luke from, it kind of rules that out because it says, quote, the elders who rule well will be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, and then he quotes the Old Testament, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And then he quotes Luke. He says, the laborer deserves to be paid.
Okay.
And so, but he uses the word scripture, which is graphe in Greek. It literally means the writing. So
yeah,
if he was talking about an oral tradition, he would have said, use some Greek word for oral tradition, but he actually says the scripture, the graphe.
Yeah, I'm not saying that an oral tradition couldn't have become written word at that point, right? I'm not saying that there wasn't anything that could be circulating at that time. Certainly there could be something written down at that point, but we're talking about one particular line that may be from this source, or it could be from a completely other different source, right? We don't know. All he says is scriptures. He doesn't say specifically from the Gospel of Luke. We know this, right? Like we just, there's a lot of questions about early Christianity that we don't know about. So,
well, I think it's reasonable to infer he's talking about the Gospel of Luke.
I don't know that it is. We just don't have evidence that supports that outside of the one line, and even then it could be from other sources, right? There's a reason why the Q hypothesis has had the standing that it has had in biblical circles, right? In scholarly circles, because of the generation of like information that comes from the Gospels, like seems to be coming from other sources. So it makes sense that the rest of it is also coming from other sources, right? Which is how the hypothetical kind of Q document comes into place. But I don't know. I'm sorry. That's really all the time that we got for this particular call. But I appreciate you calling in the seed.
Taking up the time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Taking my time, and y'all have a great night. God bless y'all.
Thanks.